Leading Ideas Talks podcast is brought to you by the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C. Subscribe free to our weekly e-newsletter, Leading Ideas, at churchleadership.com/leading ideas. Leading Ideas Talks is also brought to you by the Taking Church to the Community Video Toolkit. Explore strategies your congregation can use to reach beyond its walls with worship, community events, ministries, and service. Learn more and watch introductory videos at churchleadership.com/shop. And remember, to stay up to date with the latest church leadership strategies and information, please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos. The rapid growth in the percentage of Americans claiming no religious affiliation is drastically reshaping the country's religious and cultural landscape. In this episode, we speak with Dr. Ryan Burge, a leading expert on the nones, about the characteristics of the growing cohort of Americans who say their religion is nothing in particular.
Welcome to Leading Ideas podcast. My name is Ann Michael. I'm a senior consultant with the Lewis Center for Church Leadership of Wesley Theological Seminary in Washington, D.C., and I'm also one of the editors of Leading Ideas e-newsletter, and I am pleased to serve as the host for this episode. We are delighted to have as our guest today Dr. Ryan Burge, who's assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. He is an academically trained researcher who also happens to be a pastor of an American Baptist church, and as such, he has a special interest, I think, in using data to understand trends in American religious and political life. His work made headlines back in 2018 when he was among the first to observe that the number of people in America who claim no religious affiliation, a group of people sometimes referred to as the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, was actually surpassing the size of the nation's two largest religious groups, Roman Catholic and Evangelicals, and would in all likelihood soon become the largest religion in America. And in 2021, he released what I consider a groundbreaking book entitled The Nones, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They're Going. And this spring, the second edition of The Nones has come to press, and it is a tremendous honor to get to talk with you today, Dr. Burge. Welcome to Leading Ideas Talks.
I so much appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah. So, your books are crammed full of data and charts and analysis and lots of detail, but today I'd kind of like to focus on some of the major conclusions and takeaway for our audience, which is mostly pastors and other church leaders. And so to begin the conversation, I wondered if you could, in just a few sentences, define the term nones and describe how this segment of our population has changed in recent years.
Yeah, so for me, the nones are actually three subgroups, atheists, agnostics, and then a group called nothing in particular, which I hope would be the biggest takeaway from the book is the importance of the nothing in particular as a type of none. So if we put 5 nones in a room, one would be an atheist, one would be agnostic, and 3 would be nothing in particular. So most nones are not atheist agnostic. They're nothing in particular. This group of Americans was about 5% of the adult population in the early 1970s, stayed about that level until the early 1990s, got to about 7% by 1991. And then from that point forward, we've seen sort of an exponential rise in the share of Americans who have no religion. I call it a hockey stick. Look at the graph. It looks like a hockey stick. It goes flat from the 70s to the early 90s. And then from that point forward, it just goes up and up and up. And today, depending on what survey you look at, about 30% of Americans, adult Americans today, say they have no religious affiliation. And amongst the youngest adults, so Generation Z, it's probably over 40%, probably in the low 40% of Americans have no religious affiliation. I think it's the largest shift in American culture, at least in my lifetime, the last 40 years.
Right.
And I think we are not fully grasping all the implications and complications that come in American life because of that.
Yeah. So the next obvious question is why? And that's really what you examine in your book. And you look at a whole wide range of factors that have possibly played a role, secularization, the rise of the internet, social isolation, changing family structures. But the one thing that really jumped off the page for me was your statement, and I quote, "The best and clearest explanation for the rapid rise of religious disaffiliation can be traced back to the recent political history of the United States." Basically, you believe that there's been an exodus of liberals from the church with the rise of the religious right. So I wondered if you could explain that hypothesis and why you think that's been a significant part of this.
Yeah. So this is something that sociologists have looked at now for about 20 years or so. So I'm not the first one to kind of like say, oh, it's all politics. There's a great piece by Houghton Fisher that came out in 2002 that sort of made this claim. And this is like when the nuns were a lot smaller than they are today, only about 10% versus 30% today. But if you look back at American religious history, especially white religious history, we got to be clear about this. Amongst non-white people, this looks a lot different. Okay. But amongst white Americans, for a long time, there was space in American religion for conservatives and for liberals. I mean, if you walked into, let's say, an evangelical church in 1985, you'd be just as likely to sit next to someone who voted for a Democrat as someone who voted for the Republican. It's the same is true in a mainline church. It's like a United Methodist church, an Episcopalian church, or even a Catholic church. The pews were very divided in the 1980s. There were Democrats and Republicans. And what we've seen really is sort of a homogenization process where white religion has become overwhelmingly Republican, and now there is not a lot of space. There is no large liberal denomination in America that even comes close to matching the size and the scope and the power of, let's say, the Southern Baptist Convention. Southern Baptist Convention is 15, 16 million people. 75% of them voted for Donald Trump in 2020. The counterbalance is the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Church has about 2.5 million members, but only about 500,000 go to church every Sunday. And about 2/3 of them voted for Joe Biden in 2020. So, even in terms of scope and scale, there is no large liberal white tradition, Protestant or Catholic even. Catholics are becoming more conservative over time. And I think what's happened is a lot of moderates and even liberal white Protestants and Catholics thought, I don't want to be in an environment where we talk about things like quote unquote traditional family values all the time. I want to be in a situation where I, can hear things that I want to hear. They don't have those options anymore. And so a lot of people just said, you know what, I'll just stay home on Sunday because it's easier to stay in my bed than go hear something I don't want to hear week in and week out.
Yeah, as somebody who goes to a progressive church, I one of the things that surprises me is that my own children who are in their 30s, they think of church as conservative, even though that's not the church that they grew up in. But what they hear on the news and the way they hear church talked about in American cultural life, they somehow, they have conflated church with conservative, even though that's not true in every church.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are pockets of liberalism, but I will say though, those pockets are almost always confined to urban and suburban areas. I mean, if you go to rural America, my county, I live in Jefferson County, Illinois, which is about 40,000 people or so in rural downstate Illinois. There are a total of 4 mainline churches in my entire county. Mine has 10 people on a good Sunday, American Baptist Church. The Episcopals don't even meet anymore because they can't find a priest. The ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, and the PCUSA actually had to join together in the same building because they couldn't afford separate buildings anymore. And I think combined, they have 50 or 75 people in both services on a Sunday morning. And then there's the United Methodist. And there's a couple hundred people, and they're a prominent, wealthy congregation downtown. But again, they have a looming vote coming over same-sex marriage, and if they're going to stay or they're going to go. And there's a good chance that that congregation is going to be significantly smaller in 10 years than it is today. So there might be a scenario in 10 years in my county, there might be one functioning mainline church in a county of 40,000 people when there are probably 100, if not more, non-denominational evangelicals or Southern Baptists or Pentecostals or charismatic churches. So in rural America, we've seen the decimation of moderate or liberal religious organizations. And so for a lot of people who are of those persuasions, who don't mind Jesus and actually don't really care about the idea, they don't think it's bad, they have no place to go. And for them, nuns is the best place to be because honestly, it requires less work than being part of a congregation and having to put up with people. So
yeah. So I think a lot of us have in our mind's eye kind of a stereotypical idea of what a nun looks like, right? So we think of a millennial hipster, young, white, reasonably well educated, more likely a guy than a girl, right?
Yeah.
But another major takeaway from your book for me is that as the nuns have grown to be a much larger demographic segment, they have also become more diverse and reflective of the racial and gender diversity of our country. So I wondered if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah. So I think you actually described, I think, the textbook atheist, which is like a
Okay.
white, upper educated, upper class, white guy, living in an urban or suburban area. Like that's a textbook atheist. Atheists are 60% men and 40% women. They're actually the most gender imbalanced religious quote unquote group in America today.
Mm-hmm.
But again, atheists are only about 6% of the American population. So they're relatively small compared to our nothing and agnostics, by the way. I call them diet atheists because they're just like slightly less income, slightly less education, slightly less liberal on an ideology scale, like 10% less of everything, it seems like. But nothing in particulars are a huge part of the nuns. So like 22% of Americans are nothing in particular. And amongst college age people, 18 to 22, they're actually the plurality. 33% of young people say they're nothing in particular, more than say they're Protestant or Catholic. So it's becoming like the default category for American religion is nothing in particular. These folks are not doing well. So, from an SES standpoint, they're not getting ahead. They are the least educated religious group in America today. About half of atheists have a 4-year college degree. It's only 25% of nothing in particulars have a college degree. 60% of nothing in particulars make less than $50,000 a year as a household. A third of nothing in particulars don't have a college degree or have a high school diploma or less and make $50,000 a year or less. So you're talking like a third of this group is just struggling. Amongst atheists, it's less than 15%. So, from a societal standpoint, the nothing in particulars are the group. And I talk to reporters all the time about this group, trying to get them to write more about this group, because I think they're really important about for the future of American democracy and religion. The problem is they go, well, how do I find one? And that's the problem. Like they're everywhere, but they're nowhere at the same time in terms, they don't have like atheists. I don't, from a social science standpoint, I don't worry about atheists. They're doing fine educationally, economically, societally, culturally, and they're actually doing a lot of political advocacy. Nothing in particular do none of that. Educationally, they're falling behind. Income-wise, they're falling behind. And they don't put up political yard signs. They don't go to political meetings. They feel left out, left behind, lost, unmoored, disconnected from the larger society. And I think that is a lot more problematic from a democratic standpoint, little democratic standpoint, because they feel like society does not work for them. And that leads to a lot of bad outcomes.
But it's also important from an evangelism and outreach perspective for churches, because I think your point that this is a segment of the population that is struggling economically, but also very isolated socially. You have defined this as the biggest potential mission field for the American church, but they're people that have certain needs that the church could help with. And so, I mean, it's kind of the good news, bad news thing, but I do appreciate the clarity that you've brought to understanding that. Another thing that was so interesting to me in your analysis is, you've identified that atheists and agnostics are a pretty small segment of the religiously disaffiliated. They're people who have a somewhat well thought out religious worldview, but these nothing in particular people don't necessarily. And one of the facts in your book that just kind of blew me away was that you say that 15% of these folks who say their religion is nothing in particular actually attend religious services at least once a month. I mean, that's a higher rate of attendance than half the people in my church. So what's that about?
Yeah, I think it's because they're not. So we think about there's a great book called Secular Surge that came out by Campbell Lehman Green. It's an academic book, but they make this really interesting point. There's a huge difference between being secular and being non-religious, right? So secular people are people who have taken and thrown off the religious worldview, right? So they don't think spiritual things are the answer to questions, and they don't look for, guidance from above, things like that. They look for science and reason and logic. They've gotten rid of that and replaced it with something else. Non-religious people have gotten rid of that religious food, but have not replaced it with something else. They are defined by what they're not by what they are. And I think these nothing in particulars are a group who are defined by what they've gotten rid of, but they're not antagonistic towards religion, right? They're antagonistic towards, I think, a lot of institutions in American society, and religion just happens to be an institution like banks or big business or politics or whatever. They're distrustful because of that, but they don't have a specific beef against religion, and that's why they're somewhat still open to the idea of religious practice. Like a third of them say religion is at least somewhat important in their lives, somewhat or very important in their lives. So they still see some value in that, yet they're not willing to be labeled by saying they're Protestant or Catholic or Mormon or Buddhist or whatever it is. So and if you look I think the most hopeful thing in the data is I look at these panel surveys, which are they ask the same people the same questions over a long period of time, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I have one that goes from 2011 to 2020. So you can see how people move around religion over like nearly a decade, and during the Trump years too. And what you find is about 15% of nothing particulars say they're nothing particular at the beginning in 2011 and became Christians by 2020. I mean, so
there's movement.
And if you think about it, that's 15% of like 22% of the population. You're talking like 3% of Americans over that period of time went from being nothing to being something. And I wrote a piece for the Gospel Coalition going, stop debating atheists. You know what percentage of atheists went from being an atheist to being a Christian over that same time period? Less than 1%.
Yeah.
And you're talking 1% of 6% of the population versus 15% of 22% of the population. You're talking 30 times more successful looking for the nothing in particulars versus the atheists, because atheists aren't moving. They've adopted a different worldview.
Right. They've adopted a different worldview. Yeah.
Exactly. And nothing particulars have not done that.
Right. So that's really helpful to make that distinction, because I think it's so easy for people to imagine that everyone who's religiously disaffiliated is an atheist, and that isn't the case. So much of the other things I've read about the nuns uses the term spiritual but not religious. You don't use that terminology in your book, so I wondered if you had anything to say about that.
I don't know if I find that an incredibly helpful distinction to make, because I think at almost every level, the data says that Americans are deeply spiritual. Like if you look at even a basic question like, what is your belief about God? I think people will be shocked to know that over 90% of Americans still say they believe in God at some level. So we are overwhelmingly, at least an aspirationally religious or spiritual people.
Right.
I think really what that's about is about institutions and institutional trust. It's like the idea of like, I like Jesus and I like God, I just don't like the church because it's an institution. Yeah. And that's what people are rebelling against, I think, more than anything else. I think the biggest crisis that we're facing in America today is a crisis of trust. And that's trust of institutions, but it's also interpersonal trust. Like, do you think another human being can be trusted or not? That is what religion used to be really, really good at, is showing people that institutions are bad and corrupt and can possibly be bad. Overall, they do good things though. Just because they're made of people. And it also teaches us that people who are different than us are not bad. Church, like I talk about, churches used to be a place of diversity, political diversity, economic diversity, educational diversity. And now they've homogenized. And I think that creates these silos, these enclaves, where now you look at other people and go, you're wrong, we're right, we got it all figured out over here. That's really bad from a democracy standpoint, because democracy works because we tolerate people who are different than us, and we have less tolerance now and less trust now, and I think we're much more suspicious. Cynicism is bad. Like, I think we need to be very clear about that, and I think we live in an age of cynicism, and I think we need to fight back as Christians, especially. We need to be hopeful people and inject hope into what we talk about the future, about each other, about institutions, about society. And unfortunately, we seem to make it worse in some ways because we don't fight back against cynicism. I think religion used to be the ultimate cynicism fighter. And now that fewer people are going to church, they're not hearing those messages of hope. And I think they're reverting back to kind of our worst impulses, which are don't trust anyone, don't trust any institution, just, fight for yourself and mind your own business. That's not how we're designed to work in a democracy.
Right. Yeah, no, the loss of the social capital of the church is pretty significant in a lot of ways. If I can move on to another subject, in the second edition of your book, it covers the pandemic years, and you ask the question, what effect the pandemic had on these trends. I think many of us are in churches and have seen the significant decrease in attendance that has happened since the pandemic. Probably imagine that the pandemic has really accelerated this in a significant way. But at the end of the day, you conclude that the pandemic wasn't really that big of a factor. What you're seeing is just a continuation of the same underlying trend lines.
And that's the question. I wrote that chapter specifically because so many people asked me that during interviews over the last 18 months. What's happened? Like that, there were two theories, kind of competing theories that really go in opposite directions. One is it made us more introspective. It gave us time to pause and think about our lives and our spirituality. And then we kind of some people said, well, I need to get back in church because I need that, I need to have purpose and meaning in my life. The other school of thought was, well, people got out of the habit of going to church and then they never got back in the habit of going to church when churches reopened. If you look at the data, you really see neither theory have that much confirmation. But now when I tell people that, like a lot of pastors go, well, what you're telling me is disconnected from what I'm seeing on the ground every Sunday. Like, and the pews are emptier. I think part of that, though, is the fact that when people answer survey questions, they answer them aspirationally. Like when I ask the question, like, how often do you attend church? No one does the tally mark system. They're like, well, let me let you, last year I went 47 times. That's weekly. They don't do that. What they do is they say, I'm the type of person, given ideal circumstances, meaning no COVID, I would go every Sunday, or I would never go, and I even tell the story in the book. Let's say there's an older woman. She's a weekly attending Methodist. She's been going weekly for her entire life, and she gets cancer. And she can't go to church because she's doing chemotherapy and she can't be around a bunch of people. So she misses 6 months, and then we come in and ask her a survey question. How often do you go to church? She says every week. Is she a liar? No, she's not a liar. She's the kind of person who would go every week if she could. So I think what we saw during the pandemic is people still answered those questions in the aspirational way. Like, if no COVID existed, I would still be there once a month, or I would still be there once a week. And that's why we're seeing the disconnect between what people are seeing in the pews every Sunday and what people are answering on surveys. It's also hard to know what the decline looks like because we've been declining in attendance for 30 years now. And if attendance declined 3% between 2019 and 2022, is that 3% because of COVID, or is it just the natural decline that was going on in America for the last 30 years continuing through COVID? These are not easy questions to answer. And we might never really, truly know the answer to these questions, even in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah. Well, so all of this really begs the question for those of us who are church leaders is, what can we do? And I really appreciate the fact that in the second edition of your book, you speak really, I think, in wearing your hat as a pastor to some of this, and you make some suggestions that I thought were really helpful. So I just wanted to name a couple of them and give you the opportunity to speak to them. One suggestion you make is that churches really need to listen to the stories of those who have moved on from the church, and establish those relationships and get to know people and really hear the honest truth of what's going on in their lives. Do you want to speak to that, or maybe what that has looked like in your ministry?
I will say, so part of being a social scientist is we have to oversimplify the world. Like, there's just no way we can not explain the world without oversimplifying the world. And it's unfortunate. I remember when I was in grad school, we had this conversation about this book called Suicide by Emil Durkheim. Durkheim was trying to figure out why people took their own lives. And so he would go around to all these different morgues in Paris and collect the death records of people who committed suicide. And they actually had a ton of information on age, race, gender, but also religion. They were recorded. And his whole theory was, what he found was that Protestants committed suicide at a higher rate than Catholics did. And he said it's because Protestantism is an individualized religion and Catholicism is more communal religion. And I remember we were talking about that in class, and we were talking, someone goes, wait a minute, isn't this kind of reductive? Like, aren't we every human life matters, and we're kind of like being overly reductive by talking about this in broad strokes. And our professor goes, listen, I'm less interested in why Bob killed himself than why people like Bob kill themselves. And that's the way that we have to think about this from a sociological perspective. Like, Bob matters. Yes, Bob matters as a human being, as a pastor, Bob matters. But we also need to figure out what were the factors that led to people like Bob taking his own life. When it comes to the nuns, there are a lot of Bobs out there, right? There's a lot of Bobs, and they got to being a nun through all kinds of different backgrounds. And writing this book and doing, talks and speeches and stuff like this, people come up to me afterwards and say, well, here's my story. And a lot of times their story will touch on that aspect of what I talked about in the book, whether it be I got divorced, or I grew up in a non-religious household, or I'm a liberal, political liberal in a conservative community, and I couldn't stomach that anymore. And then every once in a while, they'll tell you something just totally random, like something that happened to them, or, a reason I didn't talk about. But what I almost always find is there's commonalities between them and what I talk about in the book, and then there's some differences. Now, we've got to be better listeners, right? Sometimes it's politics. They left because they don't like Trump or MAGA or whatever it is. But sometimes it's things like, I'm gay and I grew up in a community that does not affirm gay people, or I was abused by my parents and they said, spare the rod, spoil the child to me when they were hitting me. You'll hear all these stories of like, I was sexually abused by a pastor, or you can go on and on and on. I was spiritually abused by a pastor. So there are there's commonalities oftentimes, but there's also every individual has their own story. There's 80 million nuns in America today, and they all got there by a different path. And I think the key there is just to listen, because you're not going to be able to solve all their problems. If they're spiritually abused when they were 12 years old, you can't fix that in one meeting or 10 meetings, or even maybe 100 meetings. Your job is to listen to that and to validate that and say, I hear what you're saying. But also, if you can, sometimes people leave for dumb reasons. Like they moved the service back half an hour, and I didn't want to do that. You push back where you think it's appropriate, on things like that, but just listen sometimes and be willing to just hear these, these stories of trauma, because they do exist, and don't try to sweep them under the rug. Don't try to be apologetic about it, and say like, oh, but what about this? And what about your soul? And what about this? No, just listen to them. Be a human being first, and be an evangelical second. That's what I tell people. Just be a human being. And I think you'll get a lot more, you'll build a better relationship just by no ulterior motives, just being open and listening to what they have to tell you.
Yeah, so building relationships and social connections was one of the takeaways that I think is so important, and understanding that these are all individual people with individual stories. You also had some advice. So much of this has to do with political polarization right now. You have some advice also for how churches might address political issues in this context. I thought was helpful as well.
So I'm a big believer in, you can't just not talk about it.
Right.
Okay, I think that's really bad, because if you don't disciple your folks, someone is on these political issues.
Yeah.
And whether it be Tucker Carlson or Sean Hannity or Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes on the other side, those people are going to disciple your people if you choose not to. Power loves a vacuum. And if you don't speak into the political power that, we have as Americans, someone else is going to. But I think you have to do it in a bipartisan, nonpartisan way, which is talk about the Bible. Sometimes the Bible is going to make Republicans feel bad, and sometimes it's going to make Democrats feel bad. The concept I talk about in the Bible is Imago Dei, which is that every human being is born in the image and likeness of God. And that means that God cares about the unborn, absolutely, but he also cares about the disabled. He also cares about the immigrant. He also cares about people on death row. Every human being is born in the image and likeness of God. And I think if we can we can use theology and say you should look at politics through a theological lens, you're going to get a lot farther, and you're going to get a lot more respect from your people too, because it's going to force them to think about their political ideology. And it's going to make here's what I hate. When people go on Facebook, especially pastors love to be on Facebook. I don't really know why. They almost always give it to one party and not the other party. Stop doing that. If you're going to be political, you need to be equally critical of both sides, or avoid it entirely. Michael Jordan was asked one time, why are you not more political? And he said, because Republicans buy sneakers too. Republicans need Jesus, and so do Democrats. If you only put it on one party, what you're saying to the other people is saying you don't belong here. You're not welcome here. And I don't think churches should be trying to cut down their addressable market by doing that. They should make it as wide and as expansive as possible. And yet pastors tend to not do that. So it's a tough situation. It's hard to talk about politics in the pulpit, but we have to. I think it's our mandate as pastors to try to speak into the lives of our people about politics in a neutral, objective, bipartisan, nonpartisan way.
Yeah, no, thank you for saying that, because so many of my students think the best thing is to just, if they get any pushback at all on politics, is to just clamp up and never talk about it. And that's not our calling. So I really appreciate what you have to say about that. To draw this to a close, I have to say, I don't know if anyone has ever told you that the end of your book brought them to tears, but the end of your book literally brought me to tears. And so I thought I might close by just quoting the last few sentences of your book, because I found it so poignant. You say, the winds of secularization and polarization are swirling like never before. Most of the seeds we sow are going to fall on rocky soil, never to reap a harvest. And it seems that there are fewer and fewer people to spread that seed every year. It's easy to give up hope, but we must recall the words of the Apostle Paul to the church in Galatia. So let us not grow weary in doing what is right, for we will reap the harvest if you do not give up. Seeds that express the love and grace and hope of Jesus Christ is never truly lost. Do not give up. I thought that was such a good word, because I think so many people see these trends and it's just so discouraging. But I really appreciated the way that you brought your book to a close and reminded us how important it is for us just to continue to be reaching out to people in our community. So thank you for that.
I didn't even realize those. I wrote those words 3 years, like, and you write sometimes and you look back on it and go, well, I actually had it in that moment. A lot of times I'll write something and go back and like a day later and go, that's awful. I am so bad at this. And then sometimes you write something every once in a while and go, okay, like I can live with that.
Yeah,
so,
I was literally weeping when I read that, because I just thought it was so poignant. I want to thank you. I have learned so much from reading both editions of The Nuns. I have really studied it and just found it to be tremendously helpful. And I am grateful that you have paid as much attention to this phenomena that it's due. So I'm grateful for your body of work. You also have a new book coming out later this year, The Great Dechurching, which you've written in conjunction with some pastors. So I think that'll provide a really helpful lens on this as well. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your ministry. Thank you for spending time talking with us today.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Ann. I appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for Leading Ideas Talks. Please like and subscribe to this channel and click the bell icon to get updates for new videos.